Hello and welcome back to Understanding the American Revolution. Most of the recent videos that we've been doing have been about the Stamp Act. That's the first big flare-up between the colonies and the Crown and Parliament. It's time now to put an end to that saga and to move on because there's a whole lot more in the Revolution that we need to get to. And the end of the saga is the Declaratory Act. So this story goes very heavily with video number 10, which was, as you remember, Ben Franklin versus Parliament, where he testified on the floor of Parliament about colonial reaction to the Stamp Act and particularly why they were upset at it. It was the whole issue of direct taxes versus indirect taxes, which gave rise to the Sons of Liberty slogan, "No taxation without representation." But as we've seen, it's a little more complicated than that. So here's what happens. 1766, there's a change at number 10 Downing Street. Okay, I'm using that as a kind of a catch-all term for British Prime Minister. In this period, not all British Prime Ministers actually lived at number 10 Downing Street. Some did, some didn't. Anyway, but we call it that, 10 Downing Street. Okay, so anyway, there's a new Prime Minister. Grenville is gone, and he was kind of a hardliner. And now the new Prime Minister is the Marquess of Rockingham. Actual name, Charles Watson Wentworth. Can you get more English than that? Anyway, this guy's less of a hardliner when it comes to colonial taxation and colonial policy. Also, Parliament was shocked by the ferocious reaction to the Stamp Act. They really weren't prepared for this. And the boycotts were about to start pinching. They really hadn't started pinching yet because remember, the Stamp Act was supposed to take effect in November 1765, and it's only March of 1766, so only a couple of months. So the boycotts they were being organized in the colonies, and they had started, but their full effect was had not yet come online. But a lot of British firms particularly that did manufactured goods, were afraid of these boycotts, and so they started pressuring Parliament to do something about this problem. So then Parliament hears directly from Ben Franklin, and we went through that in video number 10, the dialogue, the back and forth, which is really very interesting and illuminating about how the colonials viewed the Crown's policies. So Rockingham is now in charge, so there's a little bit more of a conciliatory feeling in Parliament and also in the ministry. So there's a political deal that gets going. So to buy support for the repeal of the Stamp Act, Rockingham and his people float the idea of this Declaratory Act. And we're going to see what that act says in just a moment. This passes, Stamp Act is repealed, and also there's another act, which I didn't devote a specific video to called the Sugar Act. That was modified. They sort of tinkered around with that, made it a little less onerous. So, yay, end of crisis, right? The hated Stamp Act is now repealed, and everything's hunky-dory. Well, not quite. So let's get into the document itself. This is a short one, so I'll show you what the Declaratory Act says. So passed March 18, 1766. So the Stamp Act repeal was a separate piece of legislation, but then this very short act is passed. And here's the key language. The said colonies and plantations in America have been, are, and of right ought to be subordinate unto and dependent upon the imperial crown and parliament of Great Britain. The King's Majesty, etc., with the consent of lords, blah, 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 in Parliament, hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, subject to the Crown of Great Britain, in all cases whatsoever. So what does this really mean? Well, what this means is, okay, we're repealing the Stamp Act. We'll give you that one. But this act says we can do anything we want. Parliament still has the power. It was not beyond the power of Parliament to pass the Stamp Act. So that's what the Declaratory Act is declaring, is that they have the power to do this anytime they want to. They're just choosing out of amity to withdraw the Stamp Act. Now, notice something else about the language here. Look at the first underlined passage. Said colonies and plantations in America have been, are, and of right ought to be. Where did you hear that language before? In another declaration, the Declaration of Independence, where the operative clause says that these colonies are of right, and of right ought to be free and independent states. So the Declaration of Independence comes about 10 years later, takes this exact same language from the Declaratory Act and throws it right back in the face of Parliament and the Crown. So that's why language is important, and that's why I show you these documents, because the language really does matter. Okay, so we've got this threat, this possible threat that Parliament could do this again anytime they want to. That's what the Declaratory Act means. So many of the colonists took this as a threat. Maybe it was not intended that way, or maybe it was, or maybe some people in Parliament intended that way and others didn't. But many in the colonies did take it as a threat, that there might be more taxes coming down the pike at some point. So that's why the crisis doesn't really abate. I mean, yes, the Stamp Act is repealed, and that does what it does. It sort of tamps down the flames for a couple of years, but we've still got this same issue hanging out there. The issue of direct taxation versus indirect taxation. That issue is not going away and is certainly laid back on the table with the Declaratory Act. Incidentally, the Declaratory Act remains on the books even after the American Revolution, even after the United States splits off. This is still on the books in British legal system. In fact, it remains on the books until 1964, after, of course, Britain lost almost all of her overseas empire. By 1964, she was down to Hong Kong and some change. So, but notably, this is very telling, Britain did not attempt to impose direct taxation again. So they had this law on the books, but they never really used it because they had been burned by the Stamp Act. But, of course, this is not the end of the crisis. There are more taxes. There's more fees and things like that, such as we're going to get into the Tea Act and various things like that. So we're definitely not out of the woods as far as colonial outrage over fiscal policies. Okay, so we've spent weeks on the Stamp Act. Let's move on. So coming up soon, we're going to get into the Regulators, which I know sounds like a bad alternative band, but it's actually really important. And then the Boston Massacre. So I know you guys will be stoked for that. So thanks for watching. You know what to do, and we will see you again probably in a few days with a new video. Thanks. Bye.